Fairly exciting day for me. Couple new packages from my latest favorite vendor, Send Cut Send. I have designed some things that I think are going to be fun, hopefully useful when planning out my avionics. So these first pieces are hopefully the rack for my avionics. Though I designed them really hastily and had to make some last minute changes, so I give it about a 50-50 chance they actually work. Theoretically, these will hold all of the trays for my center console in the avionics. The IFR navigator, the audio panel, the radio, those types of items. This second piece is a temporary avionics panel. The one from Vans that you've seen me drool over before is, I think, 16th inch aluminum, and eventually I'll wind up having that CNC cut to house all of the pieces that are going into it. But until then, I need something that's a little more malleable and a little less expensive if I screw it up. That I can really fine tune the positioning of these, then make a final file that matches that and take it to a fabricator to cut out. So far, I'm really blown away at how well everything fits. Considering I had to redesign this thing from scratch in about 10 minutes to send the file over, yeah, I'm really blown away at how everything fits. Now, the true test will be when I Clico it to my makeshift dashboard and put all the electronics in there if everything still lines up. If it does, man, I got pretty lucky. If you're wondering why it's gold, well, I just wanted to test out the anodizing process, and I could select from a few colors. I figured there's already gold in the plane, might as well make some more. It won't be seen when all is said and done, and so this has nothing to do with any future color scheme. I was just excited to see some cool anodized parts that I created, or at least designed. I'm going to keep plugging away on this and see if it actually does work out as well as I hope it does. I wanted to real quick talk through some of the design choices on my panel. First off, you may note, if you're familiar with Garmin electronics, that some of these are flush mounted at this time. It started with the G5. I was able to pick up a flush mount kit. I've never liked how far out those bezels stood from the panel. Once I realized that I could flush mount that, I thought, why not flush mount everything? There is a reason, a very valid reason not to flush mount things, in that those bezels can be incredibly important when you're flying and you need stabilization for your hands to be able to push buttons or the touch screen. And in fact, I've dealt with this in other planes I've flown, and I've seen some of the benefit. However, I just can't get over the fact that anytime I see one of those, I'm immediately reminded of like a Blaupunkt cassette deck in a Fox Body Mustang. Like, it drives me nuts. And I'm sorry if you're a Fox Body Mustang fan, I'm not. With that, initially, I have decided to flush mount these. As you remember, I've mentioned all of this is sort of a temporary setup, and I've allowed myself some time to weigh on these decisions, to hear some other opinions, and to see how I want to move forward. Ultimately, with the way my brackets work, I can choose to have them manufactured with any amount of bezel showing. In fact, I chose, rather than some bezel showing in this initial layout, to leave myself about 1/4 of an inch between each unit in order to plant a finger or 3 and stabilize myself while I would be punching those buttons. I'm hoping there's some happy medium between form and function here, because again, the last thing I really want on my panel is like 1/2 inch bezels sticking out. It just drives me nuts. I really like the clean approach. However, I'm not going to sacrifice safety for a clean approach. Some other design choices on the configuration of the stack, or the order of the stack. The autopilot controller, the flight director, is a natural fit up top. You'll usually catch it up top because it's the shortest of the units. That makes it a great fit up top because you have a center rib running through that you need to dodge, or you need to modify. And I'm really trying hard not to modify it. However, as you've noted from before, I did some miscalculation and will need to still drop everything down a little further lower. From there, it's organized basically on the length of each unit, how much sub panel I'm going to cut out, and dodging that center rib. I would like to keep the IFR navigator up as high as possible, but that may be impossible since it is the longest unit. I'll continue to mix these around on future iterations of these brackets and future iterations of the temporary panel itself. The idea here, we're going to mess around with it, we're going to trial fit it, we're going to test drive it for as long as we can until I'm finally satisfied, and I will go ahead and have the aluminum panel cut, powder coated, and labeled. So what are the next steps here? As usual, I don't really know. I just make it up as I go along. But I know that eventually I'm going to need to run some wire. So that for me means I got 2 things to do. One, I need a wiring diagram. And I've spent an immense amount of time trying to figure out my wiring diagram. Not only did I recently take that class, that's helped an immense amount. I've dug up as much information as I can and as many sample diagrams as I can online. And I've also printed out copious amounts of pages from the G3X setup guide. It has drawn out interconnects between certain LRUs. Now, of course, there's so many combinations that you're never going to have one sheet provided by Garmin that shows you exactly how to set up your system, but you can kind of fumble your way through it. It turns out it's a lot more difficult than I thought, but it's fun for me. However, if you didn't want to do it, most avionics places are going to be able to draw these wiring diagrams for you. I think it typically runs between $1,000 and $2,000, and it's probably money well spent. I really like the education that I'm getting from this. I like better knowing my system, and again, I'm having a ball doing it. So I'm going to keep fumbling my way through it. Now, eventually, I probably will spend some billable hours having somebody go through this just to make sure that I don't smoke a box when I plug it in. When I get a little cooped up on the wiring diagram, I'm actually coming back down to the garage running some fake wire. I've bought a huge assortment of colored ribbon, and I figured if I can run all this ribbon first, it's going to do a few things for me. It's going to show me where I need to accommodate wire runs. It's going to show me how much wire of each type I need, and it's going to help me kind of troubleshoot before I start crimping connectors. I've tried to make it so I have a color for each. I have a color for coax, I have a color for serial, I have a color for CAN bus. Eventually, we would get sort of this makeshift wiring harness that I can pull out of the plane for dimensions and also layout, and then start to replace those ribbons with wire. Now, this isn't a unique idea. I think I've seen something similar done elsewhere, but of course, like anything, I'm complicating it and trying to get some additional value out of it. But Also, like everything that I complicate, we'll probably find it was a waste of time. I sort of feel like now, if I can coalesce these into some wire runs instead of just spaghetti, I'll get an idea as to what this whole thing looks like. I feel like it. So, I'm going to take some tie wraps and see if I can't just start to make dedicated runs out of multiple ribbons. I think that's the point of this exercise. I think. One thing I definitely wish I would have done is make these flags smaller that say where the wire's going and what number wire it is. They're really getting in the way. Okay, I've spent a couple hours now tidying this up, believe it or not. It takes a lot of time, and I've learned a lot. I still don't know if it was worth it. I think it was. I think I'm going to wind up saving a heck of a lot of wire in the long run. I have a much better idea how I need to approach the routing of each wire. And so yeah, I do think that eventually it'll be worth it. Let me define worth it for a moment before you go throwing your project its very own quinceanera. For 99% of people, I don't think this exercise would be worth it. But for me, who has never done this before and had no idea how much wire each of these runs would eat up and what would be the most logical order for these things to go in, it was worth it. It allowed me to refine my harness before I got into cutting expensive wire and crimping expensive connectors. It allowed me to work out some of the kinks. So for me, in that respect, it was worth it. It basically allowed me to create a more traditional board on which to create my harness with that much more confidence that it was accurate. However, before you go dumping money into your ribbon budget, you might want to speak around with a few other people who have done this before. They probably have better suggestions on how to get this done. But it did. It took a lot of time. I can now start to add lengths to my master list of wires, of known wires that I need, in order to get an idea of how much of this I'm going to have to order. Now, likely, once I have a total, I'm going to have to multiply it by at least 2, just to make sure that I have enough for mistakes, redos. Everything's going to have to be cut long to start and then trim back. The last thing I want to do is wind up an inch short. And so I will be ordering plenty of spare wire. But at this point in time, I didn't know if I needed 50 feet or 250 feet. This will help me sort of narrow that down a little bit. The next thing I got to do is I'm going to label each of these sort of connectors so that I know where it is. I'm going to pull the whole thing out, and I'm actually going to take the panel off for a bit. I'm going to put the actual panel, the aluminum panel, back on in order to take some measurements for some racks that I'm going to create for some additional LRUs and power supply components to this. I know all this stuff is remarkably dry and it doesn't make for great TV. To be honest, every night has been filled with research and wiring diagrams and charts and just trying to figure out what I need and how to run all this. Planning, really. And the project planning aspect has been huge lately, and that's not very fun to watch. In order to try and make this a skosh more engaging and realistically for my own sanity, I'm going to go ahead and put the first connector here on the flap system. Previously, I installed the Ray Allen flap position sensor. This is something that I wanted so that I could have some feedback into the system telling me what degree my flaps are at. It's a pretty simple system and it's easy to hook up. It does add 3 wires to the flap area, and so I've decided to add a connector here. Now for my connectors, I have decided to go with the Deutsch connector. They're pretty robust. They come with a great reputation compared to something like the Molex or the Micro Molex, and it just seemed like a solid system. I'm able to use the same Crimpers that I'm going to use for everything else in here. Aside from having to figure out which positioner to use, it should all be straightforward. I do like that along with the connectors, I was able to get some mounts so that I can actually clip these connectors into a structural component and either have it bolted there or connected via adhesive or otherwise. And so that should help keep things tidy. Let's take a look at what it'll take to get one side of the connector mounted up in this area. Holy crap, that's a huge spider. Now the crimpers I'm working with here are the JR Ready crimpers. They're sort of a mid-level crimper when it comes to doing this sort of thing. On the low end, there's I think some $30 or $40 crimpers that you can get from an Avionics supply. The JR Ready, the whole line's available on Amazon, and then of course at the top end there's the DMC crimpers that a lot of people use. Mixed with a copious amount of positioners that I've acquired, I should be able to use this not only for my Deutsch connectors, but any connector that'll be utilized when connecting the Garmin components. I've gone ahead and got some various clips that'll allow the Deutsch connectors to be secured mechanically or with adhesive to different parts of the aircraft so they're not floating around. I've also got some gold-plated contacts. You definitely want to use at least the solid contacts, not the stamped contacts. But then it was recommended that I even go one step further and make sure that you're using gold-plated connectors or contacts in all of these parts. Mixed with a bunch of other tools that I've acquired at the onset of this whole avionics phase of the build, I should have enough realistically at this point to get everything avionics-wise completed. The process for this connector is pretty simple. We just got to prep the wires, strip them. It's a pretty exact amount of wire lead exposed. From there, they'll go into the connector, which will go into the positioner. I've got the correct connector in here, or positioner, I should say. At least I thought I did. It's clearly not. You'll notice that I switched my positioner out for a manually adjustable one. The one that says Deutsch is not for these Deutsch connectors or something. I don't know. I do know that finding the correct positioner is an absolutely aggravating exercise, and whoever invented the system surely has no friends. Luckily, when it comes to the Garmin stuff, I have tables that translate pretty well. When it comes to these particular connectors, I'm a little lost, and so I do know that I've got this set to allow us to position it correctly. Perfect. Got to make sure it's the right positioner, and we have to make sure that our setting on the crimper is set for the gauge of wire that we're using. Once all that is set, we'll simply crimp. Connector goes into the crimper. We make sure it's seated all the way down there. The wire into the base of that, and we squeeze all the way. And that looks like a pretty good crimp. Give it the old pull test. I like it. The wire on the flat motor is a different gauge. That's okay, we can use the same connector pins. We do, however, need to adjust our selector here. The tug test. The contacts get pushed into one side of the Deutsch connector. There are some locks that go in there. I'm going to have a vacant pin, so I'll put in a pin plug. And then from there, it's ready for the other side of the connector. Our wires go through this waterproof gasket here. The order definitely not random, but determined by my wiring diagram. With all of those in place, last thing we have to do here, because I have a 6-wire connector and only 5 wires going into it, they do make a plug to go down in this final connector hole. And that white plug will just cap off any backwards. Maybe the plug doesn't go on this side. No plug for now. I can't do this. Oh, my back. Alright, let's try that again. Last thing to go in here is a wedge on this side. It should push down. That's not right. This is fucking miserable. Then we're going to drive in this wedge lock, which should lock everything into place. And from what I'm told, should simply click in. This looks right, finally. And so now, with a little bit of wire tidying and securing this connector down, it'll be ready for the other end. Now that side of the connector, the female side, will likely not be ready for a long time, as it's going to come from several components in the back of the avionics panel. Okay, we'll go right about there. It's as easy as that. Obviously, got some kinks to work out on that first one. But you might be asking, why connectors instead of just doing some slice or butt joints, I should say. There's several reasons why I want to use these connectors in different areas of the aircraft. For one, it makes servicing and revisions much easier. If I were to need to repin something, I can theoretically easily do so, versus a butt connector. I'm going to wind up having to trim wires, and some of these leads are already really short. In areas where I'm attaching components out in the wing to the fuselage, it's going to be really helpful to have a 12 or 16 pin connector that I can just plug in, have all of it pinned out on my wiring diagram, much like we see in the back of the Avionics. And with that connector is sort of the official start to wiring this airplane, and I've got a lot to come. But first, I'm going to have to wait for some of the parts I've ordered to come in. I'm going to have to get this area tidied up and make sure that my plan is thoroughly bulletproof before I start to wire up more pins, and probably work on my wiring skills just a little bit. I'm going to take some time to do that. You take some time to do whatever it is you're doing, and we will catch you next time on Ryan Flies.